This is about intergenerational risk sharing and aggregate longevity risks. Well, first question is, well, why is intergenerational risk sharing relevant for longevity risk here? A couple issues. One is it involves very long time horizons. So a succession of generation is natural to think about longevity risk and sharing longevity risk. And it has aggregate components. And when you think about it, these are the most troublesome components that for pension sponsors and insurance companies are most difficult to hedge against. And if you look at different generations, there is some natural difference in exposures. If you look at older generations, they are basically retired, they're stuck with the risks, and they're exposed to longevity risks more directly. Future generations, by that time, the time they get into the workforce and retire, things have changed. There's differences in the natural exposure and also differences in the ability to bear risks. So there's a natural, there are initial welfare gains from sharing risks. The fundamental sort of macroeconomic problem in this context is that the markets are inherently incomplete. You have a common community of current savers, current generations that are bearing the risk, and you can shuffle that around, through reinsurance from pension sponsors to reinsurance companies to others. But ultimately, all these companies are owned by the same generation, by the same cohort, broadly defined of international investors. And that, in my mind, raises the potential for an improvement here through intergenerational insurance, thinking of the government as a potential agent that could enter in on behalf of future generations. Now, the government enters in anyway, so this is something we need to look at through taxes, through public debt, to public pensions and health programs, and we need to think through this, to what extent this is done efficiently, to what extent there are improvements. Now, I'm not calling for the government as a solution here to intergenerational risk sharing. There's probably quite a potential for public-private cooperation, in the sense that private insurance companies are probably a lot more efficient in dealing with risk, allocating risk, catering to particular risk preferences and willingness to willingness of people to allocate consumption over time than the government. So there is a role, as I see it, potentially for governments on behalf of future generations to provide some insurance at terms that on an aggregate level, current institutions have a difficulty matching, and I'll try to explore that a little bit in the talk. Now, there may be some immediate questions that come to mind. Well, if governments are exposed to longevity risk already, is it actually efficient for them to take more risk? And I take that to be a quantitative question, something to be looked at, and a related pricing question. What would be the risk premiums that governments would have to charge to take over additional longevity risk? And then some, public longevity bonds have failed. There's a notorious early EIB bond, and to my mind, this bond really exhibits the flaws. The plan included private reinsurance, so if you have public institutions entering the longevity risk arena, it is really vitally important that we think of governments as the ultimate risk takers, and not just as one of the intermediaries that then try to lay off the risk on other private sector institutions. That is not really intergenerational risk sharing, and I might come back to that bit. So to give you a brief outline of the talk, I'll lay out the general framework briefly, then give you an illustrative example that I'll come back to later to illustrate the general issues. Third, do a bit of a general analysis, some of the complications, and then look at policy implications on how we can think of pricing publicly issued longevity bonds. Throughout, I'm taking a very aggregate, macroeconomic, general equilibrium view, probably a lot more aggregate than most of the other speakers in this this conference. I'm taking it given that idiosyncratic risks are covered as much as possible, given informational frictions in private markets. So that is really not a comparative advantage for governments or public-private cooperation to enter into the microeconomic risk-sharing issues. So that's why I'm focusing on aggregate issues largely. The analytical framework framework I'm using is an economic model with overlapping generations that you have a succession of generations going through the broad stages of a life cycle: childhood, working age, retirement. It's designed to model retirement savings and the arrival of demographic information in a coherent way, so a stochastic retirement period and work periods coming in, and longevity is simply the length of a retirement period in this context. Important is that it's a unified framework for a variety of aggregate risks, demographic as well as economic as well as medical, and that's important because sometimes disturbances in one area have general equilibrium effects that look like shocks to other areas. Their growth effects of, for example, a longer work period and changes in savings incentive in that context. The application of that framework is then both positive and normative. In the positive direction, we get to an assessment sort of natural risk exposures of different generations and the assessment of policy interventions in a sort of calibrated setting. And then normative questions of, okay, what is efficient, what's a good policy or not so good risk sharing policy, and then an assessment of how the current allocation compares to that, and some then natural implications for policy that come out of that setting. Let me give you one quick example here. Very stylized news is current retirees are expected to live longer and, for simplicity, assume no changes in future generations. So just a one-time generation-specific shock. What do we get out of this? Then it's really simple. In a hypothetical, laissez-faire environment without government redistribution, you would say, well, that hits the retiree generation. If they live, 1% longer, they have to reduce their rate of consumption by 1%. All the other generations are unaffected. Now, in the real world, we do have public pensions that are annuitized. We have some other intergenerational programs. For example, healthcare programs are typically annuitized, and the retirees are not charged full price for that. So there is some risk sharing there that the retirees would be compensated by future generations who would then be impacted by that disturbance. An efficiency benchmark, I come back to that, would be a benchmark of equal exposures, equal proportionate exposures that come out of an economic analysis. Now, based on that benchmark, one would conclude that the retirees are still a lot more exposed to longevity risk than future generations. And so there would be a case for improvements. For example, government issues longevity bonds. So this is an easy case. Now, in general, we have to recognize that longevity risk has multiple dimensions. There's a question of permanence. If the longevity news, medical information really gets you to mortality improvements that are more like random walks than just one-time shocks, then there is already an exposure of future generations directly to the shock, and the potential for intergenerational risk sharing is somewhat different, so the analysis needs to be a bit more generalized. And then the timing matters. It turns out on an aggregate level, a shock that hits immediately differs quite a bit in terms of the impact to a shock that might be news that will hit not the current generation, but you learn something about the longevity of the current working age generation. Then the efficient responses turn out to be quite different. Okay. Now, let me comment on the general issues here. The efficiency benchmark, the way that is derived economically is from an analysis of Pareto optimal policies, the principle that you think of a policy objective as maximizing the welfare of different generations, some weighted sum. This coming out of JME paper, and if you want to look at references in detail on this, the optimality condition is that basically the marginal utilities of different generations should be aligned and should respond to changes in aggregate disturbances in the same way. The noteworthy part of this is that this is a condition that applies regardless of the welfare weights that you input on current or future generations, or regardless of the redistributional stance on government. So you can disentangle optimal risk sharing from redistribution. And that's important here. When I'm talking about government policies, I'm trying not to introduce government policies that impose additional burdens on future generations or somehow shuffle resources back and forth. What I'm trying to get at here is true gains from trade, Pareto gains that come from better risk sharing rather than shuffling risk from one cohort to the other. Now, if the risk aversion, degrees of risk aversions are the same, then that optimality standard translates very simply into a standard of equal exposure to shocks in the sense of equal consumption responses to a particular type of disturbance. And that turns out to be a benchmark from which you can make easy comparisons, even if degrees of risk aversion differ somewhat. And there's some indication that the old might be somewhat more risk averse than younger cohorts. Okay. Now, quantitatively, this is assessed in an overlapping generations model and with usual approximations in macroeconomics. You can look at this as a log linearized stochastic process in which the world evolves, and what that leads to is some really simple, and I want to walk you through this assessment of the allocation of risk. And there are two levels in which one can do this. The first level, cut assessment, is to work out how retiree consumption and working age consumption respond to certain disturbances to the economy. For example, a shock to longevity, news about longevity being higher or lower. The elasticity of retiree consumption is one number. One can get out of that. The elasticity of working age consumption is another. If the two mismatch, you have a misallocation of risk, and you can see the direction of this. Now, as a more full assessment, the second cut on this is to say, well, if you share risk appropriately macroeconomically, you can also share risk by varying saving, by self-insurance of different generations, and the true optimality requires an optimal propagation of shocks, which can also be evaluated by looking at the change in national saving or capital investment in response to disturbances. So before I throw numbers at you, let me give you one reminder for assessing the numbers, and that's the good news, bad news aspect. For most people, I would think living longer is good news. Now, what longevity insurance is a little bit funny is that it really insures against the cost of living longer. So the good news of living longer in a macroeconomic setting is a bad news of having lower per unit consumption. So the numbers I'm going to throw at you are mostly negative numbers when I'm talking about the good news of a positive longevity shock. And a high exposure to a longevity shock in terms of exposure of marginal utility is going to be a high negative number. So you look at the absolute values as measures of disturbances. So with that, here's some quantitative results for the simple example that I gave you earlier of a temporary shock. If you have a hypothetical economy without government transfers, government insurance, it would be really simple. The retiree consumption would be reduced 1-for-1 with an increase in longevity, no impact on future generations. And I'll give you three different allocations here. One no insurance, one with calibrated current policies, largely calibrated to the U.S., but probably not to unrepresentative for other developed economies like in Europe, and then an efficient allocation, which represents the allocation of risk if you optimized the allocation. And I'm giving you three numbers there for each of the allocations: retiree consumption, working age consumption, broad, and then the optimal dynamic response of capital here. The no insurance case is really simple. Then the big comparison is between the calibrated and deficient. In the calibrated case, you see there's an imbalance of about 7-to-1 between the retiree generation and the working age generation in terms of the impact of the risks. So government transfers provide some insurance. The exposure of the retirees is reduced from 1.0 to 0.77, and the future generations bear some exposure, but not really very much by a variety of calibrations. The efficient allocation would call for equal risk sharing, so the 0.31 is the same number. Now the 0.31 is perhaps sensitive to second digit to the calibration, but the principle is the number ought to be the same, and there should be a dynamic response. Optimal risk sharing is something that should put the economy on a trajectory where you don't just have equal risk sharing in the current period, but some of the risks are being shared by future generations that come later. The current generations here, if you look at the impact effect, would be the retirees at the time when the news hits and the workers at the time the news hits. Now, one generation later, the workers in the impact period are going to be the retirees in this second period. The working age in this one period later case would be the children in the impact period. And if you had no insurance, they would be unaffected under current pension and healthcare programs as calibrated. They would be slightly affected. And the efficient allocation, again, calls for a little bit stronger effect here, 0.17 elasticity. And again, same for retirees and workers. You can play that out further for a second period, 2 periods out. So the retirees there were the children when the shock hits. The working age people here would be the ones that weren't even born when the original shock hits. So the optimal allocation of risk in this aggregate context is something that is quite prolonged for this particular shock. You have a one-time shock, and when you have the one-time hit, you can allocate that over time. That turns out to be the efficient allocations. Over time, these responses converge to zero, so you get back to a steady state, but much more prolonged than you would have in the standard market allocation, standard government policies. So that was the example. Now, in general, you have more. The temporary shock is clearly a special case, one generation living longer. In general, you might have news that will have an impact on multiple cohorts, and a model that in general, as an autoregressive stochastic process, limiting case of a permanent change, a random walk change is included in that context. And the broad finding for the more general analysis is that the efficient allocations again call for equal exposure to the different generations, but the potential for insurance is somewhat reduced, because with the more permanent the shock is, the more future generations are exposed to the same shock. So risk sharing is most efficient if you have differential exposures, and they're reduced the more permanent these shocks are. To illustrate this, here are some numbers. If you look at temporary, that was the simple case I showed you initially, the 50% persistence would be autoregressive, and then the random walk is 100% persistence. The current retirees are affected the same way because typical transfer programs really don't distinguish in terms of how much they give to retirees of what shock might have hit. They're simply annuitized. Future generations are hit more when the shock is permanent, and the savings responses accordingly differ in the market allocation when people are in the working age and anticipate to live longer themselves. They actually save more rather than save less, and so that's moved around. Now, all these responses are not efficient. The efficient responses, if you work them out, tend to be greater when the shock is permanent, because after all, the present value of consumption that is needed to maintain a similar standard of living is greater when the longevity is longer for a prolonged period of time. In all cases, the exposure of the retirees that's efficient is a lot less than what you see in the current allocation. The exposure of future generations is a little bit longer. So if I summarize this, I think a fairly broad conclusion is that retirees tend to be too exposed to aggregate longevity risks. Working age exposures tend to be too low, though the difference is somewhat less, and the range of calibrated versus efficient responses is somewhat broader than with the retirees. And the savings responses, I think, require a lot of discussion. I don't want to go into the details, but they're clearly not efficient in the market calibrated market allocations. Sometimes negative, sometimes positive. Okay, so from those results, there's a pretty clear case for more intergenerational insurance, more insurance of the retiree generations. Before I go to policy conclusions, I should raise a couple of caveats there. One is the
arrival process of the news is something that requires attention. Let me give you one alternative scenario. Suppose you have a news that says, well, for current retirees, we can't really do anything, but we got some great medical innovation that makes the current working generation live a lot longer, and that will also apply to future generations. So tough luck, current generation, current retirees, but everybody else is going to be living longer. Now, then the efficient response actually would be that current retiree benefits should be reduced, again, in the same vein of good news is bad news. If these guys don't live all that long, they don't lead that much consumption, and you would actually cut them. That's the optimal allocation here. Standard defined benefit programs, government programs, would not respond that way, and the efficient exposure would be somewhat negative for both generations. The market allocation would give no such responses. So depending on which generations benefit from higher longevity and which ones don't, and when that information comes out, the efficient responses can be quite different than in the cases that I've given you before. So the information structure matters. Now, the empirical relevance of this caveat, and that's why I'm making it a caveat, is a little bit unclear. I'm not sure that longevity is ever revealed that much in advance. Typically, we want to see it before we believe it, and so to change policy in response to hypotheses of what might happen in the future to longevity might be a little bit fragile. The second caveat is perhaps empirically more relevant and very relevant, and actually one reason why I gave you the simple example at the beginning of a generation-specific shock. A general presumption in thinking about longevity, implicit assumption tends to be that we think of the longevity as something that makes people live longer in retirement. It's seen as a hit to pension funds and to plan sponsors. Now, when you think of health broadly, you might hope that improved health also improves people's ability to work longer, to have a longer work life. And in terms of aggregate risk sharing, that makes quite a bit of difference. So if you look at a scenario where you have an innovation to longevity that also increases proportionally, let's say, the ability to work longer, then an efficient solution would call for an increase in the retirement age, would call for pension promises that start at a later age. And in that case, if you look at a permanent improvement of longevity in that context, the only generation that can't self-insure against it is really the current retirees, because the next generation, people who enter, say, at age 20 in the workforce, should anticipate to work longer and be retired longer. And if they just save at the same rate as the previous generation, they should accumulate sufficiently more saving to live through the retirement age, either direct savings or through some pension fund. So the permanent longevity shock accompanied with an increased ability to work is really very similar to a temporary longevity shock that affects just the current generations. So the numbers for the simple shock that I gave you before are not all too wrong for when you think of a longevity disturbance accompanied by a longer work life. Okay, now, there are some complications, because if you have people working longer, you get changes in the capital-labor ratio, changes in the returns to capital and labor in a macroeconomic context, and that gets you into questions of, okay, what happens when we have a higher workforce? Now, if nothing else were going on, you might think of that as putting downward pressure on wages. On the other hand, we have declining fertilities all around the world, and so the full analysis of that really requires much more of a general equilibrium analysis of multiple shocks at the same time. The insights that I want to convey to you at this point is that the burden of a permanent shock can actually be temporary if it's accompanied with other compensating changes, for example, in the work period, and there is a sense in which a general multi-shock framework needs to be employed. I can handle that, but it would get us too far into the discussion for today. Now, let me talk about policy implications. And for that, let's stipulate for the sake of argument that we take the broad conclusion as given that in the current setting, the current way in which government benefit systems work, retirees tend to be too much exposed to longevity shocks, either directly or if they save through defined benefit pension plans, the plan sponsors would be excessively exposed to those risks. The question is what can be done, and if we think of the government as entering as the agent, the only available agent of the unborn and children who can't act on their own. There are ways in which the government can enter. One clear way that's been not much discussed is a longevity bond or longevity-linked derivatives issued by governments themselves. I would suggest there are a couple other ones. If I have time, I'll comment on those that where governments can facilitate in an indirect way more risk sharing. Now the challenge in whatever way we try to implement better risk sharing is to do this in a fair way without slipping in redistribution and imposing greater burdens on those small future cohorts that are coming forward. Well, maybe some people want to impose higher burdens, but as an economist, I have to be honest and not try to slip this in. So if we think of policy adjustments, government bond issues, we have to make sure that this is not redistribution in disguise, at least an expectation before shocks are realized. All generations ought to be better off when we think of a different kind of policy implementation. Well, let's think about this. In terms of first instrument, longevity bonds, the natural proposal here would be to replace regular government debt with longevity bonds. It would have to be a replacement, because if it came in addition to the existing government debt, it would be clearly a redistribution that alleviates the burden of current taxpayers. So it would have to be a swap. So the total amount of public debt should be unchanged in the initial period. The real question then is, what are the terms of that longevity bond, publicly issued longevity bond? Should this be an actuarial fair payment? Should this be something that is charging a risk premium all along the lines of what private sector bonds charge? What should be done here? The conditions for Pareto improvement here is that the risk premium, and jump ahead, yes, there should be a risk premium. The risk premium should be low enough that the bond buyers are better off, that the takers of insurance, and the risk premium needs to be high enough that future taxpayers are not worse off. The insight from intergenerational risk sharing that sort of carries right over is that if risk sharing is imperfect, there needs to be gains from trade. There ought to be a range of Pareto improving risk premiums that make buyers and sellers both better off. Let's think about this. Let's take be clear here about the macroeconomics of risk-bearing. Simple example, let's take a 30-year zero-coupon bond that has a payoff proportional to a longevity index that's realized 30 years down the road. Now, there are, of course, a lot more complicated products you can think of, and that might, on a micro level, work better. But just for the sake of example, let's take a simple case, 30 years out, roughly one generation. What are the payoffs here? The buyers of those bonds would be current retirement savers, either directly or via institutions. I'm taking an aggregate view here, so it's a see-through view through institutions. Ultimately, the current investors are the generation that saves for retirement, the people who are currently setting funds aside for their retirement period, either directly or through corporations that have defined benefit pension plans, or through insurance companies. Okay, if you have a private sector longevity bond, the sellers of that bond are necessarily the same generation. There may be different institutions, but ultimately, if you have a reinsurance company, the reinsurance company has shareholders. Those shareholders are ultimately bearing the risk of the reinsurance company backstopping bonds. So it's ultimately the same pool of investors, broadly construed, that holds those bonds. And when you look at the pricing of longevity bonds in the market, they reflect the pricing and the risk aversion, the risk exposures of the current community of savers. Now, to the extent there are liquidity issues, the current allocation might be a little bit worse, that the risks are concentrated in particular areas. And the way I'm thinking of the emerging market on longevity risk is a market that allocates that exposure more efficiently within the community of current investors, but there's a lower bound. Ultimately, the risk is borne by the people that are out in the market. The potential for government issued bond here is that the effective sellers are taxpayers when the bonds mature. So the effective sellers are the current children and unborn, and the government is acting on their agents. And then the Pareto improvement comes from the fact that you only need to compensate those sellers for the risk correlated with their consumption, not with the consumption of the people who are in the market currently. To write this in terms of asset pricing, you can think of a risk premium as covariance of marginal utility and asset returns, roughly relative risk aversion times exposure to shock, in this case longevity, and then the variance of the shock. The risk premiums in the market would be based on the risk aversion and exposure of the current generation. Basically the consumption risk in retirement. The compensation for a government bond, the premium that the government needs to charge, would be based on the risk aversion of future taxpayers, basically the consumption risk of the next generation. So as a first cut, if you think of risk aversion as roughly time invariant, constant relative risk aversion paradigm, you would think that the ratio of compensation to the market risk premium is roughly the relation between working age exposure and retiree exposure. Now, to the extent that older generations are more risk averse, that ratio of compensation to market risk premium could actually be less. So this is a conservative assessment for what the compensation would have to be for the risk premiums. Now, based on the numbers I've given you before, depending on the nature of longevity shocks, that ratio is somewhere between 1/7, 15%, and 54% in this particular calibration. Now, generally, longevity bonds, if they just pay out in proportion to realized longevity, there is no disentangling what kind of longevity shock it is, a permanent or temporary one. So to be conservative, let's take the worst case of a permanent shock. The result there is that on the margin, taxpayers would be compensated, future taxpayers, if the government were willing to issue the bond with a risk premium that is a little bit more than half of what the efficient private the premium on private issues of the same kind of bond would be. Now, where in that range between 54 and 100% would one be? That's then a question of sharing the gains from risk. If the government issued this bond at a premium that underprices private issuers by 46%, then the gains from that bond issue would all accrue to current savers who would get those longevity bonds really cheap. If the premium was closer to 100%, the gains would accrue to future taxpayers who would get a fairly high risk premium that is greater than the compensation that they really need. Okay. Now, one complication here is that the assessment here is on the margin based on the current allocation of risk. If there were large-scale public issues of longevity bonds that would have an impact on the allocation, you would take out some of the risks from the market. You would impose some risks on future taxpayers. So then the relative risk would change. If you think it through, if you go all the way to an efficient allocation, you would have a risk premium of about 60% of the initial risk premium. So that might be a sort of benchmark number based on simple calibrations of what the government would have to charge. So between 60 and 100 is the range of Pareto improving changes there. Now, particularly I'm not sure how much time I have. Oh, very good. Couple quick things, sort of rough, more work in progress sort of ideas of what else can be done. I think outright issue of longevity bonds is a very clear, very simple, very transparent tool of changing the allocation of risk. There are other indirect ways that can come in. I have some work in progress on thinking about the payout structure of public pensions. There's an argument that the government actually has a comparative advantage in covering the very, very tail end of life, which is, I think, well recognized in health that, at least in the United States, Medicaid pays for, nursing home care and things like that at the very end. But the similar arguments based on, the cost of annuitization privately versus in the public sector suggest that it would actually be efficient for the government to start covering retirement consumption at a later date, but then more generously. Again, in the same vein of efficiency improvements, not reducing pensions, but just starting them later and then having a larger amount. Now, if that were to happen, there would be a beneficial side effect, and that is that the degree of longevity insurance would be increased. If you think of say, years from 90 to 110 being covered by greater public payments, if you think of news stocks about longevity, since the probability of living over 90 is fairly small, any given shock is likely to have a bigger proportional impact on those years if they were covered more by government pension payments and more generous health payments that would naturally increase the degree of risk sharing for a given level of government benefits. So there's some way to optimize. And then there is a role, arguably, for regulations. I've commented a bit on this in the Dutch case, that when you think of private pension funds, if they are offered on an voluntary basis in companies, you can't really do intergenerational risk sharing very well because there is a voluntary entry and exit decision that young cohorts coming in will not enter into a pension fund. That's actuarially unfair. But if you have a general mandate for people to be in some industrial or larger sectoral pension fund, I would think there is some potential for risk sharing to be done for private pension funds to be able to charge a little bit more when they're underfunded without losing new participants if the pension system is properly regulated. Though my sense is that there is some limit to the extent to which you can bring in new people and make them share risks in a private sector scheme. So if the shocks are too big, it makes sense to have some government backstop in the form of either reinsurance or bonds, which different facets of the same thing in an aggregate context. Couple issues that are non the model complications. There's clearly heterogeneity across the income distribution. If you look at the very poor, they rely largely on public benefits, so there's really not an issue. They're covered. If you look at the very rich, you're really looking at controlling dynastic wealth, and if there are large, bequests left, then the amount of bequests can clearly respond to changes in longevity of the patriarch or matriarch in the Rich dynasty. There may be some potential for international risk sharing to the extent that demographic shocks are different, but to the extent that medical knowledge is internationally transferable and generally shared among the major countries, I would think the potential is not all that great. And then the amounts that would have to be shared, paid out, raise questions of whether the ability to collect is actually there. And you may have some worries about excessive public debt. If public debt is already too large and the ability of the government to burden future taxpayers is limited, then of course their ability to engage in risk-sharing contracts is limited. One idea in this context might be sovereign wealth funds as potential natural issuers of longevity bonds, because they're managing wealth on behalf of future generations. So they act on behalf of future generations, and there's no question about their solvency because they have assets. So that's something maybe for the practitioners to think if there's some potential from gains. So from a macro level, that looks to me as something fairly natural. So to conclude, the intergenerational risk sharing has some potential for welfare gains because future generations are naturally excluded from financial markets as they're set up. And governments are in a position to engage commitments. Now, governments make those commitments anyway, so it makes sense to think about how to do it right rather than do it by custom and convention and by historical accident. And the main finding for longevity risk is that the retiree generation is clearly too exposed currently. There are welfare gains from providing more risk sharing, in particular with government issues, longevity bonds, which should not be issued without a premium. There is some compensation needed, but one that should probably be at better terms than what purely private sector solution can deliver. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I may ask a very silly question because I'm not sure in the literature if the government is really risk averse or any empirical studies showing they're risk averse or they are risk neutral. I'm not sure. Is it risk averse? Because you talk about the compensations to the government for issuing these longevity bonds. Yeah. So this is based on the risk averse parameters, right? Based on government's risk averse parameters, or
it's based on the risk aversion of future generations.
So it's not the government itself. The government represents them, but not the government itself, right?
Not the government.
Okay.
Itself. The government is just the agent.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
I would like to, what is the impact of longevity risk on the level of interest rate in general, on interest rate in the market? With the links between consumption and interest rate and so on?
I don't see a direct link when I'm thinking about government-issued bonds because there would be a swap of existing government bonds for longevity-linked bonds. So the amount of bonds on in the market would be unchanged. So I don't see a first-order impact. There may be some in that different changes in risk exposure might give you a change in precautionary savings, but that would be, I would think of as second-order change.
Okay, thank you.